Thanks you guys for coming. Maybe some more people will join us, but we'll close those doors so you don't get interfering noise. But thanks so much for coming. We're celebrating the 50th anniversary of the Apollo 11 moon launch today. I'm Corey, I work here at the Library and Programming and Outreach Department. Today we have Dr. Rob Maher, professor at MSU Electrical and Computer Engineering Department. A child of the 1960s, he grew up fascinated by the U.S. space program, particularly the Apollo mission to the moon. Thanks to his fascination with American accomplishments in space, he knew from an early age he would be an engineer, even before he knew what an engineer was. While his professional expertise in this field of audio engineering, he has long been a keen amateur historian of NASA and the early space flights. He loves sharing inspiring stories of the Apollo program with his students and his friends. And we're lucky enough that he lives in Bozeman and we can get him to come talk at the Bozeman Public Library. So, I'll shut the doors just so you don't get some interfering noise, but feel free to hang out afterwards. We'll be playing music of the 60s. We've got a fun photo booth in the back that we can snap your little Polaroid photo. We've got some refreshments and some space-themed cookies. We're all about celebrating space. It's so cool. So, thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Corey, for the introduction, and all of you are super good sports for being inside on a beautiful day like this, but I'm delighted that you're here, and I hope you'll get some of my enthusiasm about a 50-year-ago memory of the first steps on the moon. Looking at those of you that are here, I can tell a few of you were around at that time and probably remember actually listening to the landing itself, and that's great. And then there may be a few of you here who are under the age of 50 and have only read about or seen movies about the moon landing. So what I'm going to do today I guess I have about an hour, and we'll see if we need all that time to go through this, is to try to talk about some of the aspects of the Apollo 11 mission that might not be things you already know about. So I'm going to try to point out a few individuals and a few items that are perhaps less known than the general principles. And then also talk a little bit about kind of how this came about. How did the decision to go to the moon happen? And also it'll leave the question of why did we just go in the 1960s and early 1970s and then haven't bothered to go back since then? You know, what is the kind of political aspects that go with this? So that's the plan, and so I have a PowerPoint presentation, and I will go through this and talk a little bit about each of the examples. I also have some sounds and videos and things to play as part of this, and so we'll get started. So the space race, or the decision by the Soviet Union and the United States to engage in a competition to go to the moon, was a very prominent feature of the 1960s. And it was in the context of a lot of other political things that were going on, but it was certainly a very prominent activity. I think it was actually a very interesting and good competition, because the two sides were faced not with rules based on like the Olympics, you know, how you participate in a game and things like that. But these were the rules of physics, the fundamental principles that both sides had to face the same set of constraints and the same problems, and had to use their ingenuity to figure out a way to make this happen. So I think it's kind of an interesting topic. In order to go to the moon, the principles, kind of the theory behind it, was pretty well known by the late 1950s. So people kind of knew the mathematics and the description and the astronomical observations that were going to be necessary, but the engineering, how you actually do it, was not known really at all. And so there were a lot of things that had to get figured out in an extremely short period of time. And I think, as I'll mention a few times, I was just marveled at how quickly things happened. For some reason in our era, we aren't able to do things fast anymore. You know, things do not happen with urgency and imperative the way they did back in the 60s, and it's an interesting thing to look at. Along the way, there were some tragedies. There were some very bad things that happened, and some things that are looked back on with great sadness, and at the same time, part of the ultimate triumph was based on the fact that sacrifices were made and they were deemed to be appropriate, and we'll look at a couple of those as we go. And then I'll wrap up with a few concluding remarks. Now, to get us kind of in the mood, I collected a few sounds that you would be listening to in the late 1960s. Let's see if you recognize some of these. Oh, you'd be hearing that. So, oldsters remember Three Dog Night. That one is interesting because if you go to a football game nowadays, they often play that during one of the breaks in the game. So 50-year-old song and Neil Diamond, and occasionally you hear that. So a variety of other songs, and the kind of the music of the late 60s was a very thing that was getting you kind of in the mood. If you went to a movie in 1969, here's a few of the films that were the most popular, the top grossing movies that year. So Butch Cassidy, True Grit, the Easy Rider, kind of a counterculture sort of a movie. Anybody remember Cactus Flower? Okay, so again, there were certain movies that were extremely popular at the time that haven't stood the test of time and sort of aren't still in our memory from there. 1969, in the bookstores, if you went and bought a book, and you probably remember books, they're these things with paper pages in them that people used to buy. So those were some of the popular books in 1969. TV shows, Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In, a comedy show, was on. Gunsmoke and Bonanza, these westerns. Marcus Welby, MD, Beverly Hillbillies. Some of these you can see on reruns even today. There was another show that ended in 1969. Maybe you recognize this.
Space, the final frontier. These are the voyages of the Starship Enterprise.
So Star Trek, the original series, was on TV right before that. The last episode broadcast of the original Star Trek series was in June 1969, about a month before the moon landing. And of course, even today there are new Star Trek shows going on, but that was a 1969 thing. If you looked in advertising, what were people buying in 1969? At that time, there were still television ads for cigarettes, which we no longer have, at least not the conventional ads, but that was there. Coca-Cola, Pepsi were the big beverages and had a lot of publicity all over the world at that time and are still at least somewhat well known. The other thing that was common in 1960s was ties to the space program. So for instance, here's an ad for Bayer aspirin, and they're mentioning that on the Apollo 11 spacecraft were 72 Bayer aspirin tablets. So they're advertising the appeal of you should take Bayer aspirin because it's used by astronauts. Here's Tang. Tang, a breakfast drink that is related to something that astronauts consumed in space, and so they would use this as advertising. And so if you were a kid, you wanted to be cool like astronauts, and so you'd be looking for these products. space food sticks. These are little wrapped up, chewy kind of breakfast treats that people would eat, and again had this tie to the space program. So in addition to sort of the regular cultural things going on, this was a big part of that. Now, turning to kind of the fundamental question is, in order to get to the moon, you have to decide you're going to go, and then you have to figure out how you're going to do it. And that's, of course, what happened. And the question is, well, why was it the 1960s? Why didn't this happen earlier, or why was it later? Sort of, what's the background there? So just a real capsule summary, and I'm not obviously going to cover everything here, but at the end of World War II, in the mid-1940s, the Germans, Wernher von Braun, a German space expert, had worked on the V2 rocket, which was a rocket that was launched by Germany toward London, and several of these impacted and they carried a warhead so they would blow up. So the idea of having a rocket or a self-powered missile that you could launch was sort of already a known concept. After the war, Chuck Yeager was a pilot and was the first to pilot an aircraft faster than the speed of sound. And so the glamorous Glennis, this Bell X-1 aircraft, you can still see it's hanging in the Air and Space Museum in Washington, and it was the aircraft that first beat the speed of sound, and so there was this idea of aerospace becoming more and more important. The U.S., of course, had used atomic bombs in World War II. The Soviet Union developed nuclear weapons shortly after the war. And the Cold War had developed, and the United States had emphasized the use of aircraft to deliver nuclear weapons should there be a war. So the U.S. had a big advantage in strategic aircraft. So the Russians, or the Soviets at that time, the Soviet Union was interested in trying to catch up somehow, and so they were developing also hydrogen bombs and other types of things, but they had a big disadvantage in these strategic aircraft. So they were taking some of the information that was available on missiles and developing their ideas there that would use intercontinental ballistic missiles rather than bombers. So the Soviet Union had emphasized that, and their experts had gotten very much into that part of it, the rocketry that was being developed. Then came the late 1950s, October 1957, and the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, which was the first time anybody had launched a satellite, an artificial satellite, into orbit. And the United States had been working on this, and other countries as well, but still everyone was sort of shocked that the Russians, the Soviet Union, had actually made this launch take place. That led very quickly to people in the United States being worried that if the Soviets could launch something into orbit, they could easily put an atomic bomb in that vehicle and bring it down onto the United States as a surprise attack. And so there was a worry about a missile gap, that the United States had fallen behind and now had this threat that needed to be dealt with. And the strategic bomber force that the United States had was not a really good deterrent, because it took many, many hours for a jet to fly over that distance, where these rockets could make that journey in just minutes. So President Eisenhower in the late 1950s and Congress formed NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, which was a civilian agency to parallel the work that was going on in the military to work on various kinds of rockets. But at this time, the United States, which generally had done everything out in public, was constantly being embarrassed by rocket failures and this scramble to try to catch up. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union was doing step after step that showed that they were much more advanced and much more prominent in the work that they were doing. So after Sputnik was launched in 1957, the U.S. did launch a rocket and a satellite finally, Explorer 1, and that went up a few months later, early in 1958. That satellite actually stayed in orbit for 12 years before the orbit decayed. It was assumed that it was going to come down much sooner, and Sputnik was only up in orbit for a year or two before its orbit decayed and it burned up. But Explorer 1 stayed up much longer. The other things that the USSR was doing right away was that they were launching these lunar spacecraft. Did you realize that? They had spacecraft traveling by the moon in the 1950s? So they even had one of them that they deliberately crashed into the moon in September 1959. So this was at a time when the United States was barely getting anything even into orbit, and the Soviet Union was already sending probes out to the moon. And even had a photo from the far side of the moon. The first time anybody had seen anything from that was done even in the 1950s. So really remarkable how far ahead they were. Then came 1961, and the Soviet Union put an actual live astronaut into orbit, and Yuri Gagarin circled the Earth. The United States, a few months later, managed to get Alan Shepard into space, but it was just a ballistic shot that went up and lasted 15 minutes and came right down in the Atlantic Ocean. Didn't go into orbit at first. So right after that May 1961 period, this was in the Cold War, there was this decision made that the U.S. was going to now engage in a competition with the Soviet Union in various space endeavors. And here's a segment of an address by President Kennedy at the time to Congress about urgent national needs.
Recognizing the head start obtained by the Soviets with their large rocket engines, which gives them many months of lead time, and recognizing the likelihood that they will exploit this lead for some time to come in still more impressive successes, we nevertheless are required to make new efforts on our own. For while we cannot guarantee that we shall one day be first, we can guarantee that any failure to make this effort will make us lost. We take an additional risk by making it in full view of the world. But as shown by the feat of astronaut Shepard, this very risk enhances our stature when we are successful. But this is not merely a race. Space is open to us now, and our eagerness to share its meaning is not governed by the efforts of others. We go into space because whatever mankind must undertake, free men must fully share. I therefore ask the Congress, above and beyond the increases I have earlier requested for space activities, to provide the funds which are needed to meet the following national goals. First, I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. No single space project in this period will be more impressive to mankind or more important for the long-range exploration of space, and none will be so difficult or expensive to accomplish. We propose to accelerate the development of the appropriate lunar spacecraft. We propose to develop alternate liquid and solid fuel boosters, much larger than any now being developed, until certain which is superior. We propose additional funds for other engine development and for unmanned exploration, explorations which are particularly important for one purpose which this nation will never overlook: the survival of the man who first makes this daring flight. But in a very real sense, it will not be one man going to the moon. If we make this judgment affirmatively, it will be an entire nation. For all of us must work to put him there.
So this was back at a period of time where the way our government worked, the president would often make a request to the Congress for an appropriation to actually make money available to do something. So this concept is not something we're very familiar with in our current era, where this particular budgetary aspect is not handled very well. But at this time, this was an urgent request by the president to say we need more money to engage in this race, and he is proposing that going to the moon was going to be the big part of this, or the big featured part of the space development. And in this Cold War context, the worry about the Soviet Union getting ahead, the Congress was favorable to this request, and actually then started this funding to begin the program. Now, the scientists and engineers at NASA were suddenly faced with this statement that our goal is to go to the moon and return the astronaut to the Earth by the end of the decade. Okay. And suddenly it's sort of, well, that isn't that far away, just, 8 or 9 years, and we haven't done anything. We've shot Alan Shepard into space for 15 minutes. That's it. Okay? So the idea of how you would actually go about doing it had to get figured out, and it had to get figured out very, very quickly. This is a slide that's just giving us an idea of the scale of the Earth, shown over here on the left, and that's the moon, that little dot over there on the right. So if you could somehow go out in space and look back, this is an actual scale model. So the moon is about 30 Earth diameters away. So in some ways, that's really just the neighborhood. It's very, very close looking at it this way. On the other hand, that's a long, long, long way out there, and trying to figure out how you would carry enough food and oxygen and get there and communicate via radio and get back and navigate and all that is needed to be figured out. For just one of the things, the moon is orbiting the Earth, right? So if you launch a rocket toward the moon is moving. So you have to predict with the rocket where it needs to be when it gets in the vicinity of the moon, because it's not where it was when you started. If you want to have communication with the Earth, you have to worry about, well, where are the antennas on the Earth to do that communication? You have to worry about, well, what is the lighting condition going to be like on the surface of the moon when you get there? And all of these sorts of mission planning questions had to be addressed. Now, how do you get to the moon? Now, back in science fiction writing, people had always imagined that you would get to the moon in a spaceship. You just fly out there, you'd land, and then you fly back, much like you might with an airplane. Or maybe you would do like Jules Verne thought, a huge cannon, and you'd shoot essentially a bullet with astronauts inside at the moon, or something like that. And so the engineers involved in this had to start figuring out, well, what is really feasible? How can we go about doing this? And these ideas of these ballistic approaches were very quickly ruled out because the acceleration required would kill a person if they were, going to try to ride in such a contraption. And as we'll see, one of the issues about how do you land on the moon and how do you get back, there are a lot of physical and fundamental issues associated with space travel that are not real intuitive. And so some of these things, again, were not particularly well understood. Now here's a name of an individual. Anybody familiar with John Houbolt? Have you heard that name before? Okay, this is a very important figure in the history of NASA and the history of the moon landing. Why? Well, John Houbolt was studying this idea about how to get to the moon. Most of the mission planners assumed that there would be a direct ascent, like the old science fiction approach. A rocket would launch from the Earth, would fly to the moon, land on the moon, and then it would fly back. Okay. Now, Houbolt looked at all of the equations governing the mass, the forces required, the amount of fuel, all of the parameters that went into this, and it became very clear to him that this would not work. This was not going to be feasible with the rocketry and the knowledge that was available. So instead, this is back in the early 1960s, around the time that the president was requesting this plan, he had figured out that the way that you would actually be able to accomplish this is having a special lander that would land on the moon, and that's all it needed to do. So you wouldn't bring the entire fuel and everything that you needed for the mission down to the surface. You'd only have this contraption that would be enough to bring the astronauts down there. Now, when he proposed this was going to require lunar orbit rendezvous, meaning that you had to have a way of astronauts on different spacecraft meeting up in orbit. This is something that had not ever been accomplished before and was considered extremely risky, and most of the planners said, no, we're not even going to consider that. But John Houbolt spent a lot of effort and went outside channels and did a whole bunch of things to make himself kind of antagonistic, but managed ultimately to convince people that his argument was true. And in fact, as the other engineers started studying what he had done, they realized, yes, in fact, this is really the way that we're going to be able to do this. So Houbolt had calculated that in order to do direct ascent, you'd need a huge rocket to land on the surface of the moon, because that rocket would have to have enough fuel to get all the way back to the Earth from that position. And a 65-foot tall rocket landing on the moon, he was concerned that even at Cape Kennedy at that time, they had a whole fleet of technicians around to make sure the rocket would launch, but on the moon there was going to be nobody there, and they were just going to have to count on it working. So what he had proposed then is instead to use this lunar excursion vehicle, later called the lunar module, as the way to get down and land on the moon. And that module only needed enough fuel to land and take off again, and only enough oxygen and only enough food and water and everything just for the period of time that the astronauts would be there. And they would leave all of the other required products in orbit. So you wouldn't need a rocket capable of landing and taking off from the moon with everything included. Okay. So nowadays, this seems pretty obvious and it's very well understood, and of course that's how it ultimately happened. But in the early 60s, this was, again, this revolutionary idea. So Houbolt very quickly was recognized as being an important proponent of this ultimately successful technique, and received a special commendation from the NASA administrators very early on to say, hey, you know, this really saved this whole mission in doing that. Okay, then September 1962, President Kennedy gave another important address. This one was at Rice University in Houston.
If this capsule history of our progress teaches us anything, it is that man in his quest for knowledge and progress is determined and cannot be deterred. The exploration of space will go ahead, whether we join in it or not. And it is one of the great adventures of all time. And no nation which expects to be the leader of other nations can expect to stay behind in this race for space. Those who came before us made certain that this country rode the first waves of the Industrial Revolution, the first waves of modern invention, and the first wave of nuclear power. And this generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it. But why, some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. And I think that we must pay what needs to be paid. I don't think we ought to waste any money, but I think we ought to do the job. And this will be done in the decade of the 60s. It may be done while some of you are still here at school at this college and university. It will be done during the terms of office of some of the people who sit here on this platform. But it will be done, and it will be done before the end of this decade. And I am delighted that this university is playing a part in putting a man on the moon as part of a great national effort of the United States of America. Many years ago, the great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said, because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there, and new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked. Thank you.
So for people like me, people of a certain age, I get choked up when I hear people talking that way. So even after all this time, the meaning and the importance of this adventure that the United States was going to engage in was a very appealing thing. And as was mentioned in the introduction, you know, I was 7 years old in '69, but the idea of doing these kind of things was just very appealing, and is one of the reasons I think I ultimately became an engineer and got into the science field. It was just so exciting to me as a young person. Now, along with this desire to go to the moon and how you would get there, one of the questions was, what is the lunar surface like? Nobody really knew. People were worried maybe it was just dust, and so the lander would come down and just would sink 50 feet into loose dust. Maybe the surface would combust and blow up when the rocket engines got near it. Maybe it was really rocky with cliffs and boulders and nobody could actually land there. So along with the manned aspects of this, there had to be also this decision about, well, how are we going to find out what's going on the surface? So one of the things that happened were a set of missions that the U.S. launched called Ranger. And, the Ranger missions were robotic spacecraft that simply flew to the moon and crashed into it. But on the way, they turned on TV cameras to look at what the surface looked like. So at this level, you could get telescopes that could give this resolution. But as it descended farther and farther, then you started seeing details that wouldn't be able to be seen from the Earth. So the last few frames here, right before the spacecraft hit the moon, were studied a lot to see what are all the details and what was available there and all that sort of thing. So again, they started getting some idea about what was happening. Now the Soviet Union had launched Luna 9. This was in February 1966. That was the first craft to make a soft landing on the moon. So we often think of Apollo 11 as being the first moon landing, but there were 7 previous spacecraft that landed safely on the moon and took pictures and did various things. In addition to Luna 9 and Luna 10 from the Soviet Union, the U.S., after the Ranger program, started the Surveyor program. And the Surveyor missions were very similar to the missions we're now sending to the first missions we sent to Mars, which is just a spacecraft that lands and then has a camera and looks around. And the surveyors also had a little shovel that reached out and dug in the soil of the moon to kind of understand a little bit more about what was going on there. And I'm going to jump ahead here a little bit. Apollo 12, so this is the one after Apollo 11, that spacecraft landed on the moon close enough that the astronauts were able to walk over to Surveyor 3, which had landed on the moon a couple years earlier. So this is Pete Conrad, the astronaut, taking a picture next to Surveyor 3 with the LEM in the background. This is my second favorite picture of the Apollo program, was this idea. And I always wonder if maybe in my lifetime I'll see an astronaut photographed from the surface of Mars standing next to the Viking lander or something like that. The other interesting thing about this is that on the Surveyor 3 spacecraft was a camera. You can see it there in the picture, and the astronauts detached that camera and they brought it back to Earth. So if you go to the Air and Space Museum at the Smithsonian in Washington, you can see the actual camera that sat on the moon that the Apollo 12 astronauts brought back. So anyway, kind of an interesting part of that. Okay, so that's jumping ahead. So let's jump back to where we were. So in addition to coming along with the Surveyor missions, the manned part of the Apollo Ultimate program had 3 steps, and the first step was called Mercury. And the Mercury spacecraft, included the first launch with Alan Shepard. They were a very simple spacecraft. Only one person could fit inside. They had very little maneuverability. They had a radio, and the astronauts typically had a camera and the ability to turn around and things, but nothing really complicated. But they were allowing a lot of the basics to get figured out. It very quickly became apparent that before going to the moon, there were going to need to be a lot of things figured out about space travel. How to rendezvous spacecraft, how to communicate, how to deal with emergencies. And so there was developed the Gemini program, which was a spacecraft that was only intended for Earth orbit. It was not a spacecraft that could go to the moon. But many missions were done with 2 astronauts inside the Gemini spacecraft, and they were able to test out a lot of the different features. So they were able to do what's called a spacewalk, They opened the hatch, and then they could float out in their spacesuit and understand how to work in zero gravity. They did the various kinds of re-entry profiles to understand how you get back to the Earth from orbit and so on. And then finally, of course, was the Apollo program, which were the moon vehicles, the spacecraft that followed John Houbolt's description about how to get to the moon with these special kind of spacecraft. And we'll, of course, see more about that in just a second. Now, let's just take a moment here and look at kind of the timeline of how these different things happened. This is a kind of a complicated chart, but I just want to kind of give it the ordering here. So we listened to part of John Kennedy's statement to Congress saying we need to go to the moon before this decade is out. So that happened in 1961, right after Alan Shepard had been launched into space for 15 minutes. So the Mercury, the single astronaut missions happened during this little over a year, around 1961. The speech we heard from Rice University where the president is saying, you know, we choose to go to the moon and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. So that was in 1962. The Gemini missions were out here in the 1965-1966 time frame. These red triangles I've shown on here are the Ranger missions, and the first 5 Ranger missions trying to go and crash into the moon didn't work. The rocket blew up, the trajectory was wrong, so they were complete failures. Ranger 6 actually managed to hit the moon, but the television cameras didn't work. So it was finally Ranger 7, 8, and 9 were the ones that actually sent back pictures. And then the circles here are the 2 Soviet soft landings on the moon, and the stars are the Surveyor missions. Surveyor 1, Surveyor 2 crashed, Surveyor 3 was successful, Surveyor 4 crashed, and so there was a lot of messing around going on along with the Mercury and Gemini part of the program. Now things were getting set to try to get to the moon by the end of the decade, and you can see our end of the arrow there is 1967, and then something very tragic happened. So after the Gemini program, Apollo was going to start with the manned missions, and Apollo 1 in January 1967 was an extreme tragedy, extremely sad situation. So the 3 astronauts that were going to be part of that first mission in space were practicing in the capsule on the rocket at Cape Kennedy. And during one of their practice sessions, they had the capsule pressurized to high pressure to verify its integrity, and a fire broke out in the capsule with the astronauts inside. And in that high pressure oxygen atmosphere, the fact that a fire started, it burned with great intensity, and they were killed very, very quickly due to that fire. There was an investigation, of course, that occurred after that, and the spacecraft and the reason that it had started on fire was studied very extensively. There were some shoddy workmanship. There were a variety of design choices that were done in haste because, remember, things were happening very quickly. And just generally, it was not a well-designed spacecraft. The fortunate thing in many respects about the tragedy was it caused everybody involved to stop and rethink what they were doing, and suddenly they started not cutting the corners that had been cut up to that point. And so many of the people involved, of course, are in great grief about the loss of the astronauts at that time, but in many ways say that the ultimate success can be traced back to the fact that that terrible tragedy had occurred. So there was a major redesign of the command module and its various features and changes to the process. Now, December 1968, this was coming up on the time in which the decision to go to the moon was going to have to be made. The Apollo spacecraft had been redesigned, the command module, and the Saturn V, the big space rocket, had been tested a couple times. The first Apollo Saturn V rocket went very well. The second one was a terrible semi-success, but several of the rocket motors were shut down in the process. It had a lot of vibration and other problems. So the third Saturn V launch, after one success and one ultimate failure, turned out to be a mission all the way to the moon. So again, this was a period of time when, because of this competition, people were willing to do things that probably nowadays wouldn't be thought of. But the Apollo 8 mission with the Saturn V rocket went all the way to the moon and orbited the moon. Now, the lunar module, the little module to go down to the moon, was not yet ready at that point. And so, rather than just doing this mission in Earth orbit, they decided to go to the moon just to orbit it and test out other aspects of the mission at that time. And some of you may have seen the famous Earthrise photograph. This is a photograph of looking back at the Earth with the desolate lunar surface in the foreground. And that came from the Apollo 8 mission. What I'm showing here is a black and white photo. This is actually the first one that was taken. So astronaut Bill Anders on the spacecraft was photographing out the porthole the surface, because very soon astronauts were going to come back and they were trying to get good images of the lunar surface. And he happened to glance out another porthole and saw the Earth, this blue marble coming up, and he says on the transcript, "Wow, look at that." And the other astronauts, Frank Borman and Jim Lovell, also look out and say, "Oh, that's great." So he took a picture with the camera that he was using for the lunar surface photography, which was black and white. And you have to be a certain age to remember when cameras had film in them. It's this material that you had to load in and wind and everything like that. Well, that was all that was available at this time. So he took this photo, and then they scrambled around the spacecraft to find a color film module that they could attach to the Hasselblad camera to take it. So then he snapped off, when he got the color film, this photograph, which again is now color, and you can see the brown of the Earth, surface, land, and the blue and everything. And then he took a second photograph, which is this one. So those three photographs were taken at that time. Now nowadays, of course, we're kind of accustomed to this sort of thing. At the end of 1968, this had huge impact on people to see the whole Earth. I'm in this photo. I was alive in 1968. Some of you were also. Everybody who was alive in 1968 is in this photo, except for the three astronauts that were on that spacecraft. So the importance of this picture, and we'll see another one kind of like it later, had big impact.
Do they know which continent it's looking at?
Yes, I think this is Australia over here and Asia up here, but I could be wrong about that. But yes, they've reconstructed everything about this, and they know the orbital things. They know exactly when this is and where it was taken and where the spacecraft was with respect to the moon, and it's been studied a lot. One of the things that the astronauts chose to do was they were orbiting the moon on Christmas Eve of 1968. And so at the end of a little TV broadcast, they read from the book of Genesis. And so from lunar orbit, they made this kind of statement, being Christmas Eve and all. And there was also a U.S. postage stamp made later that included essentially a painting of this same photograph at that time. The other interesting thing to me is that 1968 had been an extremely wrenching year in the U.S. The Vietnam War was going on. Martin Luther King was assassinated in 1968. Robert Kennedy was assassinated in 1968. There were lots of turmoil, riots, lots of things that were very tough in this country. And so Time Magazine, the editors, when they were going to pick their annual Man of the Year or Person of the Year issue, actually chose the three astronauts from Apollo 8, thinking that at the end of the year this was sort of this hopeful, maybe something good could happen out of this really tragic and terrible year 1968. So they happened to choose the astronauts to do that. Okay, so here we are, Apollo 8, December 1968. And then, in 1969, was when the planned moon landing was going to be. So Apollo 9 was the first time that astronauts actually got into the lunar module. So it was available to participate in the testing, and that was just in Earth orbit. They didn't go to the moon with it. Apollo 10 later in the year, actually went all the way to the moon and was sort of a dress rehearsal. So the astronauts got into the lunar module and went through the first steps to start landing on the moon and just practiced everything and worked out all of the kinks, and then returned. And then that set up Apollo 11 as the ultimate first attempt at a moon landing. Most of the planners assumed that there would be an abort, or there was maybe 50-50 chance that they would actually land on the moon with that mission, but they had enough time still in the planning here that they could maybe get there on Apollo 12 and still meet this goal of, during the 1960s, getting to the moon. And then mathematicians, of course, also said, well, you could technically probably count all of 1970 as still being in the decade of the 60s and so on. So they sort of had ways that they were going to get around that issue. But anyway, you can see how this all happened. So from the very start here of the president saying, we want to go to the moon before the decade is out, all of these things happening, the Apollo 1 fire, all of these test landings, development of all the spacecraft and the rocket, and then finally being ready for Apollo 11 at that time. All of this is just compressed into such a short period of time. It's really remarkable. So the Apollo 11 mission, for a variety of reasons, the astronauts chosen included Neil Armstrong, Michael Collins, and Buzz Aldrin. These three individuals had been part of Gemini flights earlier, so they had some space experience. All had been test pilots in their careers. Neil Armstrong was recognized among the astronauts as being one of the most level-headed and cool cucumber kind of people, and had a lot of things going, for him. And the other astronauts, again, had various capabilities and experience that really made them a good group to go to the moon on this particular mission. Now, when the spacecraft is ready to launch on the big Saturn V rocket, almost all of the rocket is just the propulsion and fuel. So the astronauts themselves are inside the command module, which is just this teeny little piece at the very top of this huge stack. And the only thing that will come back from a successful mission is that command module. Less than 0.5% of the original mass comes back. Everything else is used just to get to the moon. It's the fuel to get up to speed and so forth. Now, the command module is attached to a service module. It contains the tanks that have the oxygen and various propulsion things in them. And then inside this little kind of a neck area here, that's where the lunar module is hiding. So it's inside there, and it's also launched at the same time as the rest of the rocket. And then once the rocket gets into orbit, the command module and the service module are pulled out. They go in and grab the lunar module, this portion, and pull it out of the third stage of the main rocket, and that's all that goes to the moon, is just those pieces. Now, one of the things that, for those of us who work with computers a lot, that's really interesting is the development of the flight control computer and navigation computer that was used on the spacecraft. Originally, there was some thought that all of the computation could be done on Earth in Houston on a big mainframe computer, and they would simply send instructions to the spacecraft. But it became clear that for safety reasons and for just the fact that things had to be done on a very precise timing, it was going to work better to put some smarts into the spacecraft. Now, nowadays we're accustomed to carrying around little boxes that have connections to the internet and computation and everything else, but of course in the late 1960s nobody had even really dreamed of that, or maybe they had only dreamed of that. There was certainly nothing available. So the development of the primary guidance and navigation computer was a big thing that happened in parallel with all of these other activities. Now, as it came time for the astronauts, the two astronauts, Armstrong and Aldrin, to go land on the moon in the lunar module, the third astronaut, Michael Collins, stayed in the command module in orbit while this was going on. And the computer is the only way that they were actually able to land this spacecraft. They needed the computer to work and work properly in order for that to happen. So P63, P64, P66 are just the names of the computer programs that were running on this crude 1960s era computer that they had on board the spacecraft. Now, another interesting name involved in the space program you may or may not have heard of was a person named Margaret Hamilton. Is that a familiar name to anybody? There's the Wicked Witch of the West named Margaret Hamilton, the actress, but this is a different Margaret Hamilton. But Margaret Hamilton was a woman who worked at the MIT laboratory that was developing the software, which was kind of a new concept, that was going to run on this computer. And here she is, standing with a printout of all of the code that was used in these guidance computers. And this is such an iconic photo that there's actually a Lego kit, Women of NASA. I've got this kit that depicts her with this stack and the thing. So you can buy this kit of Margaret Hamilton. But she developed this concept of how they would put together this computer program in order to work effectively for all the things that it had to do on this mission. And there are other people involved, but Margaret is recognized as one of the leaders of this effort. And so again, a little known name, but the landing on the moon is because of people like this who did their job very, very well. And in 2016, this is Margaret Hamilton. She received the National Medal of Freedom from the President at that time, recognizing her key work in developing this concept of this type of a software system. All right, I'm going to play a video here that is edited a little bit, but it's showing the few minutes prior to the actual landing on the moon of the Eagle lunar module. And there are a couple of things I want to say about this. This particular video, it's showing which computer program is running. Keep in mind that the video that you're seeing here of the picture out the window from the lunar module was filmed at the time on 16 millimeter film with a camera looking out the window. So this was not live. So if you were listening in on TV like I was and some of the other oldsters were at the time, all you heard was the audio. So if you want to imagine the stress and the tension, don't look at the picture, just close your eyes for a second and just listen to the voices, because that's all that the rest of us heard during this landing attempt. The spacecraft flew in first with the windows facing down, and so the astronauts were going feet first along the surface of the moon. Then it rolls over with the windows up so that then the spacecraft can come and land this way. So the pictures here seem to be rotating around, and that's part of what's going on during the actual landing. So let's see if I can get this running.
Roger, you're a go to continue power descent. You're a go to continue power descent. Roger.
Altitude 40,000.
And Eagle Houston, we got data dropouts. You're still looking good.
LH is minus 2,900.
Roger, we copy.
At the Earth, right out our front window. Houston, you're looking at our Delta H.
That's affirmative.
Program alarm.
It's looking good to us, over.
1202. 1202. Good radar data. Altitude now 33,500 feet.
Give us a reading on the 1202 program alarm. Roger, we got you. We're going at alarm.
Roger. 330.
6 plus 25, throttle down. 6 plus 25, throttle down.
Roger, copy. 6 plus 25. We're still go. Altitude 27,000 feet.
Same alarm, and it appears to come up when we have a 1668 up. Roger, copy.
On time.
Roger, copy, throttle down.
Throttle down. Instead of in the simulator.
Roger.
Bags and things look real close. Descent rate 129 feet per second.
We copy. Eagle, you're looking great. Coming up 9 minutes.
We're now in the approach phase, everything looking good. Altitude 5,200 feet.
Manual attitude control is good. Roger, copy.
Altitude 4,200.
Houston, you're a go for landing, over. Roger, understand. Go for landing. 3,000 feet. Copy. Alarm. 1201. 1201. Roger, 1201 alarm. We're go. Same type. We're go.
1,400 feet, still looking very good.
Roger, 1202. We copy it. 35 degrees. 35 degrees. 750. Coming down to 23. 700 feet, 21 down. 33 degrees. 100 feet down at 19. 540 feet down at 30. Down at 15. At 400 feet down at 9. Gate forward. 1050 feet down at 4. 33 and a half down. They're pegged on horizontal velocity. 300 feet down 3.5. 47 forward. Put up. Down 1.5 down. 70. Happy shadow out there. 50 down at 2.5. 19 forward. Altitude, velocity light. 3.5 down. 220 feet. 13 forward. 11 forward, coming down nicely. 200 feet. 4.5 down. 5.5 down. 160 feet. 6.5 down. 5.5 down. 9 forward. Good. 120 feet. 100 feet, 3.5 down, 9 forward. 5%. 185. Okay, 75 feet. Guys looking good, down 1/2. 6 forward. 60 seconds. Lights on. 6. Down 2.5. Forward. Forward. That's 40 feet down 2.5. Picking up some dust. 30 feet, 2.5 down. Great shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward. Drifting to the right a little. 20, down 1/2. 30 seconds. Forward. Just. Good. Okay. Contact light. Okay, engine stop. ACA at a descent. Mode control both auto, descent engine command override off. Engine arm off. 413 is in. We copy you down, Eagle. Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
So the landing had taken place, and in interviews with Neil Armstrong later, he says that was the mission as far as he was concerned. This getting out and actually walking around was sort of, that wasn't a big deal. It was actually landing was the key thing that he had trained for and that he was the most satisfied with. And several things about that last part of that was this program alarm. So this is a photograph of the lunar module. This panel right here, this is the DISCI, the display and keyboard of the Apollo guidance computer that was used. The computer itself is a box that's located elsewhere in the spacecraft. If you visit the American Computer Museum, you can see one of these guidance computers. They have an example one there here in Bozeman. But anyway, this is the computer, and this is just what it looks like more directly. So it had several lights and then these indicators that gave various readouts and so forth. And so one of the lights here was a program alarm, and this is depicting what the astronauts would have seen in the spacecraft. The program alarm light on, and then this 1202, which was an error code, and that error code indicated that the computer was not able to complete all of the tasks that it was being asked to do. Okay. Now, remember Margaret Hamilton, the computer programmer? They had developed this executive to run on this computer that did things in a priority order. So the most important things got done first, and then the less important things got done afterwards. And in this case, they didn't get to all the less important things. The computer simply restarted back at the top of the list with the most important things. So it was resilient, and there was a great study later to figure out why this happened. But at the time, the concern the astronauts had was, well, if the guidance computer isn't going to let us land, we're going to have to abort. And so Armstrong, you can hear in his voice, give us a readout on the 1202 program alarm. You know, it's kind of, you know, are we going to have to get out of here, or are we going to be able to land? So another name that you may or may not be aware of is an individual named Steve Bales. There's a photograph of him there. And I guess I mentioned I'm dressed in kind of the 1969 flight controller outfit. I've got my white shirt, my narrow 1969 era tie. I'm wearing a duplicate of the Apollo 11 Manned Spacecraft Center badge. This happens to be Cy Liebergott, a different controller than Steve Bales. I also brought a slide rule with me that, again, back before we had hand calculators. You know, in this era, if you look on the counter there, you'll see people had slide rules to do math. I think I can multiply with this, and that's about all that I can do. Anyway, Steve Bales was the guidance officer, or GUIDO, and his job was to monitor the flight computer and know where the spacecraft was at all times. So he was hired by NASA right out of college in 1964 when he was 22 years old. He was GUIDO of Apollo 11. He was age 26. The average age of the flight controllers during the landing was 28. There were people as young as 24 in there, and even Gene Kranz, the flight director, was 35 years old. So these were young people, and as a college professor, when I think of my graduates leaving the university, that, you know, this is barely older than they are, and people were doing remarkable things even at a young age, and this is an example of that. So Bales, this guy, had a 24-year-old computer specialist, Jack Garman, in the back room, and they had to, on the spot, say, is this 1202 program alarm a reason we're going to need to abort the whole darn mission, or can they continue? And fortunately, Garman, this other guy, was quick enough to remember this particular code and realize that it was okay, that the resilience of the flight computer would allow them to land. After the mission was over, President Nixon was giving various awards, and he gave a Group Achievement Award to the mission control staff, the people dressed like me. And when he gave that award, he said to Steve Bales, this is the young man when the computer seemed to be confused, and when he could have said stop, or when he could have said wait, said go. And so the fact that he said we're go on that alarm is considered one of the great actions of mission control at that point. Okay, well, I'm up out of my time. I think everybody's seen pictures of the walking on the moon and so forth. A plaque on the leg of the lunar module. But I need to show you my favorite picture of the Apollo missions is this one. And let me tell you why. You see what that thing is up there in the sky? That's the Earth. See what's in the foreground here? The astronauts were walking around the lunar module taking pictures simply to document the condition of the spacecraft. But it's always marveled to me the idea you'd be standing there, you'd look up, and there would be the Earth up in the sky, just the way we look at the moon. It just something about that just blows my mind. And the fact that they were pretty much taking pictures to show the condition of this and happened to have a photobomb from the Earth back there was pretty remarkable. So then, of course, after they got out and walked on the moon, they had to get back into orbit, and so the upper part of the lunar module launched off again. I like this photograph that Michael Collins took right prior to the rendezvous, because it in some ways is reminiscent of the Earthrise photo from Apollo 8, but now we've got the moon and the Earth and then the lunar module coming up. So it's kind of a nice bookend to that aspect of it. This was a film taken from the command module with, again, a 60mm film camera that's showing the lunar module coming up, and I edited it, but from the beginning you barely can see a little dot in the distance as it makes its way up. And so the flight computers and the navigation radar had to get these two spacecraft into the same orbit at the same time. The rocket motors in the lunar spacecraft used propellants that are called hypergolic. There are two propellants and an oxidizer and a hydrazine fuel that as soon as they come in contact with each other, they combust. So you don't need to light a match or do anything like that. And so these were designed to be extremely reliable. And if you're sitting on the moon in the lunar module, you want a rocket to get back in orbit that is super reliable. And so they used that type of a design, and those again were very, very successful. Okay. So one of the interesting things about the Apollo program is that at its peak there were more than 400,000 people that had some role in these missions, either at a supplier or in mission control or helping the astronauts get ready or interpreting photos or whatever. So huge number of people. And is any one of those people super essential? Well, I've mentioned several here that I think probably were. John Houbolt, Margaret Hamilton, Steve Bales, certainly the astronauts, but there were many, many others who worked on different aspects of this mission. There were a total of 6 moon landings, so after Apollo 11 there were 5 other ones, and so 12 people walked on the moon between the Apollo 11 landing in '69 and the Apollo 17 mission in December of '72, and only 4 of those 12 are still alive, and you can see they're all getting up there in years. But Charlie Duke, who walked on the moon on Apollo 16, is actually the voice from Mission Control during the Apollo 11 landing. He was the capsule communicator. So he's the one that says, Roger, Tranquility, there's a bunch of guys about to turn blue. That was his voice. He actually got to go to the moon himself later on. Harrison Schmitt was a geologist, and so he was the only sort of pure scientist who ever went to the moon on the final mission. And boy, it was an exciting time. And I appreciate your patience in listening through all this kind of thing. And we're over my allotted hour, and I apologize for that. But as you can see, I get excited about these things and get going. But if anybody has any comments or questions, I'd be happy to hear about them.
Do you have time for a few questions?
Certainly I do. And again, everybody, if you want to go, that's fine. But yes, sir.
Yeah, I was reading somewhere where they were very concerned about the ascent and redocking with the orbiting, and that some newspaper had already come out with a headline about stranded astronauts. Because they said they had only one chance. If they missed it, that was it.
Well, again, a lot of us think that it would be easy, based on like watching Star Wars, that you just point your spacecraft where you want to go and you fly there. And the physics of orbit are much, much more complicated than that. And so if the lunar module had rocketed off in the wrong angle, now the orbiting command module and the lunar module aren't even in the same orbit, and they can't get back together. So that would be, of course, terrible. So it has to launch at exactly the right angle and at the right moment so that the two spacecraft can rendezvous. And understanding the dynamics of that and predicting that and having the timing down and the guidance system in order to do that was a huge accomplishment. A lot of it was worked out during the Gemini missions to try to figure out how to do that. So it's things like if you are in a lower orbit and you see a spacecraft in a higher orbit and you want to catch up to it, if you try to go straight toward it, you get into a higher orbit, which means your orbital speed is slower. You actually fall behind. So it's counterintuitive. You actually have to stay in the lower orbit and get ahead, then go to the higher orbit, slow down to do the rendezvous. And so these sorts of things were, again, not intuitive to most people. Michael Collins, the command module pilot, in his interviews many times is mentioning the biggest concern that he would have would that he would come back alone, meaning that the lunar module would crash during landing, or there would be a problem where it was not able to get back into orbit. He was very confident that he would be able to rocket out and get back to the Earth, but he was very worried about that landing part of it for the reasons you mentioned. So, yeah, John.
At the picture of the Apollo 11 rocket taking off, above the portion that's going to go to the moon, there was another telephone pole look like sticking up. What was that?
I think it was the escape tower.
Yeah.
The thing on the very top? Yeah.
So during the launch phase, the command module there was actually a whole cover on it. It's kind of a white cover, and that's to protect it during the launch phase from the atmosphere. And also the other thing is that the rocket and the whole spacecraft sits out on the pad for about 2 months before the actual launch. So it's protected from birds landing on it and stuff like that. But yes, above that is this tower that's an escape rocket, where if there was an anomaly with the launch where the rocket was going to blow up, they would actually send a command to this rocket, which would pull the astronauts in the command module away from that, and it would go some distance, and then the parachutes would open and it would land, hopefully.
So that got dumped somewhere in space?
Yeah, once they get above the altitude at which that would be possible, so after the first stage is burned out, they actually jettison that. And so it rockets away and pulls the cover off the command module. So you don't see that later on. That's right.
Where does it go?
Just down and burns up, coming down and lands in the ocean. Yeah.
I'm not so sure about the Soviet history. I don't think they ever had a person who walked on the moon. Why not? Why did they, if they were so far ahead and they had all these soft landings, what went wrong?
Well, it's an interesting thing. So the Soviets had developed these big rockets. Part of the reason was that their ability to miniaturize nuclear weapons was not as good as was available in the United States. So the United States didn't need big rockets for ballistic missiles because they could make their thermonuclear warheads smaller. So the Soviets needed these bigger rockets. But in order to get to the moon, you need an even bigger rocket. And so the U.S. had developed this Saturn V rocket in order to do that. The Soviet Union was developing a similar class of rocket and had various problems with it. And their chief designer, who had done a lot of this work, actually died. And it's sort of because of their system is a little different than ours, there wasn't apparently a good way to make up for that loss. And so they had several explosions of these rockets on the launch pads. Thankfully, the U.S. never had a Saturn V blow up and destroy the launch pad, but the Soviets had that problem. And basically, they just couldn't recover at the pace that the U.S. was operating. Now, another little-known aspect of the Apollo 11 mission is at that time, the Soviets had launched Luna 15, which was an unmanned lander. And it turned out what they wanted to do was get to the moon right before Apollo 11, land, grab some rocks with a thing, launch back and get back to Earth and scoop, so to speak, the U.S. by bringing back a sample before Apollo 11 got back. And that Luna 15 crashed at some point during the mission. So they were, again, trying, but they had basically at that point did not have a rocket capable of delivering the astronauts to the moon to land. And essentially they gave up. They never did that. So that never became part of their work, and then very quickly they moved into developing space stations and other types of planetary activity. They've been to the moon with crawler since the time that the U.S. was there. So they've done robotic missions, but not ever put astronauts there. Final comment about that is shortly after the end of the early 1970s, the U.S. had a Skylab, where they used a Saturn V rocket, and instead of having the lunar module and other pieces needed to go to the moon here, they put an orbiting space station around the Earth. And following that, there was an Apollo-Soyuz test program where the U.S. and the Soviets decided to cooperate, and they actually had a manned Soviet space vehicle and the U.S., essentially the command module that would go to the moon, but they just stayed in Earth orbit, and they actually docked and shook hands and showed that they could work together. And of course, since then, the cooperation on the International Space Station and so on has been very important. But yeah, it's interesting, isn't it, that they didn't get there. Yes?
Why was the U.S. moon program named after the Greek god of the sun?
You know, I don't know that right off the top of my head, but
a little weird.
I'm sure there were very good reasons or decisions on how these things were named what they were named, but I don't know the answer to that. Yes?
What would your comment be to, like, the conspiracy theorists are out there who say, oh, they didn't really go, it was all filmed in a Hollywood studio, it was all made up, the shadows are wrong, or whatever they say. What would be your rebuttal?
Well, I don't think there is any reasonable doubt that it actually happened, and I think the joke I always hear is that NASA didn't spare any expense in staging this. They actually decided to do it all on location. So, yeah, I think that by now the idea that somehow the U.S. government would be so competent that they could keep a conspiracy like that secret for 50 years is just ridiculous. So yeah, it's not a sensible thing. I think people sometimes just for entertainment like to imagine, what if this was all fake, but it actually happened.
It was a joke to the Flat Earth Society.
Well, there's a couple headlines after the Apollo 8 mission where they said that they had to admit that it sure looked like a round Earth. So, yes, sir.
I read a book about the Apollo 8 mission. It's called Genesis. And it was in the book, they point out that they had a 50-50 chance getting those astronauts back on Apollo 8, but they went anyways, and they got lucky and got them back.
Yeah, that, for many historians and many engineers, that was the most audacious mission, was Apollo 8. As I mentioned earlier, that was the third Saturn V launch after a 50-50 success rate on that, and the fact that you would have the guts to send astronauts all the way to the moon is really remarkable. And this was really not that long after the Apollo 1 launch pad fire. Many of you, of course, are familiar with Apollo 13, a couple missions later, that had a service module explosion that, if that had happened on Apollo 8, the astronauts would die, because the way they got back on Apollo 13 is they used the lunar module as a lifeboat. They used its oxygen and propulsion and navigation to get back. On Apollo 8, there was no lunar module. And so had they lost the service module on that mission, they would have perished for sure. So yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Remember that Christmas broadcast, and my mom finally goes, "It's Christmas," and shut out the TV, so we only got to watch part of it.
Well, the final statement, Frank Borman says, "And from the crew of Apollo 8, we wish all of you good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth." Is his last statement, and very memorable for those of you who were allowed to stay up and listen to that. Yeah.
The travel from the Earth to the moon, it was like 200,000 miles. How was the time period that it took to travel?
It took 2 or 3 days to do that. You could do it much faster, but the thing that you have to remember is that in space there's no drag. So once you get going, Newton's law says you are going to continue going. So you could get there faster, but then you would need more fuel to slow down and actually go into orbit. So essentially you need more fuel to get up to speed and then more fuel to slow down. And so the mission planners, again, had to trade off the fact that you could use less oxygen and less food if you got there faster, but then you needed more fuel in order to actually get into orbit and not just shoot past the moon and keep going. And so these decisions, again, this is, for engineers like me, is really the cool part of the mission, is they had to figure all that stuff out and optimize all of those choices. And the fact that then it ultimately worked with a bunch of 26-year-old people sitting in mission control is it's quite a testament.
And before that, Alan Shepard had gone how many miles up?
Barely 100 miles.
100 miles.
These are just, I pulled off my shelf obviously I like this stuff. So these are book covers of a bunch of books that I've read about this, and obviously there are people who know much more about this, people who have actually worked in the Apollo program, and you can get a lot more information. I think of the astronaut books, the one by Michael Collins, Carrying the Fire, is probably the one I would recommend if you're interested in kind of getting an astronaut's point of view of Apollo 11. He's very witty and very well written book. The other one that I particularly like from a mission control standpoint are The Failure is Not an Option by Gene Kranz. He was the flight director during the landing. And if you want to know more about the guidance computer and so forth, there's several really interesting books, and nowadays you can get an online simulator and actually program up the Apollo guidance computer if you really like that sort of thing. And this book by Cy Liebergat, that's the one where I got the badge that he wore in mission control during Apollo 11. He was one of the people in charge of the electronic control system of the command module. He became well known among flight controllers during the Apollo 13 mission. He was the one who was on the console at the time they had the explosion on board the spacecraft. So he had to do the initial things. He's played by Clint Howard in the Apollo 13 motion picture, if you've seen that one. But he's written a book as well. Yeah?
When the Apollo left Earth orbit, it was 24,000 miles an hour escape velocity. As I remember from Apollo 8, they'd slowed down to like 2,000 or 3,000 miles an hour when lunar gravity overcame Earth gravity and they started accelerating to the moon?
Exactly.
Is that approximately right?
So when you leave the Earth, the gravity of the Earth is still there. And so it's a little bit like if you imagine going uphill. You start a ball rolling uphill, and you're going to try to get it over the top of the hill, and the gravity of the Earth and the gravity of the moon are pulling in opposite directions. You got to get the ball going just fast enough to get over the crest of that hill so the moon's gravity would then pull it in. So it's slowing down the entire way toward the moon until it gets past this point where the moon's gravity now exceeds the Earth's gravity, and now it pulls the spacecraft in. So all of these things had to be calculated. And again, you've got this choice about speed. For all of the early missions to the moon, they wanted to have what's called a free return option, which means if you didn't fire the rockets when you got to the moon, you would be going slow enough that you would just go around the moon under its gravity influence and then would end up coming right back to the Earth, like a big figure 8. And so they wanted the speed to be slow enough that they could get that free return if they needed to. So if there was a malfunction on the spacecraft, they'd still get back, at least in the vicinity of the Earth. But yeah, you're right. It was definitely slowed way down along the way. Yeah?
How much did each of the segments of the various Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, each of them lost that launches cost? So each of those, like, were they working for, we're going to try to get it within this many, or this? What was the price frame on some of that?
Yeah, I've seen some discussions of this, and part of the problem is if you try to talk about dollars, you got 1969 dollars, and then you've got 2019 dollars, and 50 years of inflation can make a big difference there. But I'm not sure exactly how the total cost was distributed between Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. The Apollo spacecraft, with the extensive engines and the Saturn V's and things like that, were, I'm guessing, at least 80% of the total cost of the project was in Apollo. But yeah, the whole budgetary thing, trying to predict in 1961 when it wasn't even really decided how you were going to go about doing it, is pretty amazing. Yes?
What do you think about going back to the moon?
Well, that's interesting. Just yesterday, Michael Collins and Buzz Aldrin were in the White House with the president, and they were talking about this. And both Aldrin and Collins are, of course, space, aficionados, and they both are saying, well, we shouldn't bother with the moon anymore. We've been there. We should go right to Mars, and so on. So I guess for me personally, I would be interested in continuing on with these manned missions, but I think we probably have a lot that we could do nowadays with robotic missions and things like that are much less expensive, much less risky, and would be much more interesting to land a spacecraft on one of the moons of Jupiter, for instance, that have this fascinating geological stuff going on, and I think that would probably be funner than a mission to Mars right now, because a mission to Mars, I'm almost positive are going to land in a very safe spot to be not risk the astronauts too much, and that's probably a boring part of Mars. So yeah. I'm kind of, I like the excitement and the human accomplishment of these crewed missions, and going to the moon would be cool in that sense, but I think ultimately more as looking at the big picture. I don't think we've really done all we can with the robotic missions. So, not much of an answer, sorry.
No,
what do you think?
Kind of curious. It's weird that you and I are the same generation. I remember watching Neil Armstrong walking around the moon, so they're going, wow. Also, guys in Vietnam were watching that.
Yeah.
And the whole world was watching. And so we got to see this, and then this is so many years ago, faint memories, but it was one of the biggest memories of my childhood. And we haven't been back.
Yeah.
And of course we know it's a financial thing.
Yeah.
It's just so expensive to go there, it's not really worth it unless there's a monetary value in going there.
Yeah, or a political gain that is to be made, and I guess that's kind of my argument, was this sort of coincidence of these Cold War influences and the fact that it was not really uncertain that we'd be able to do it. You know, how we were going to do it was a question, but the theory of the travel to the moon was well understood, and so it was really an engineering issue, not so much of a scientific discovery involved in making that happen. I have a grandmother who was born in 1899, and she has since passed away. But I remember thinking back about her because during her lifetime, the Wright brothers took the first flight, and during her lifetime, was the World War II era, and in her lifetime, people landed on the moon. And I'm thinking that span of years, from 1900 to 2000, the rate at which things happened in kind of the aerospace field is just mind-boggling. And I wonder sometimes, in the 2000 to 2100, in that 100-year span, are we going to see a similar, huge accomplishments? And it's hard to know if that will happen. But certainly, going from not even having an aircraft to landing on the moon, that's would not have been predicted, I think, by many people at the time. Well, you've been wonderful, good sports, allowing me to share my enthusiasm about all of this information. And like I say, there are many, many, many sources of information. And so if you are a young person and wanting to find out more, I certainly invite you to do that. In the era of the internet, there are so many ways that you can get copies of information and photographs and videos and things like that. So in many ways, it's easier now to find out about these missions than it was in the 1970s or whatever. So. Great, thank you very much.